Girl is left in the cold by her cruel stepmother. Father arrives and finds a desperate scene. The night was particularly cold in that small town. The icy wind blew through the deserted streets, and the houses were adorned with Christmas lights, creating a cozy and festive atmosphere for everyone except Laura, who was about to face a cruel fate. Laura, an 8-year-old girl with brown hair and curious eyes, had decided to explore her creativity in an unconventional way that afternoon. Wearing a thin pajama that barely protected her from the cold, she adventured through the house, drawing with colored markers on the living room walls. The drawing was a chaotic mix of shapes and colors, an innocent attempt to express her imagination, but a mischief far from welcome by her stepmother, Beatriz. Beatriz was a woman who, although visibly concerned with appearances and order, had little patience for childish mischief. Upon returning home, she found what Laura had done, and the reaction was instant. Beatriz's face turned red with anger and disappointment upon seeing the walls decorated with the girl's colorful marks. "Laura," Beatriz called, her voice echoing through the house's corridors. "Come here now." Laura, scared, ran to the kitchen where Beatriz awaited her with a severe expression. Her eyes were filled with tears, but the stepmother didn't seem willing to relent. The warmth of the kitchen contrasted with the cold that was beginning to settle in the house, and Laura felt the weight of guilt and worry pressing on her small shoulders. "Do you have any idea how much work it will be to clean this up?" Beatriz asked, her tone sharp and laden with frustration. "You know you can't just do whatever you want around here." Laura tried to apologize, her words coming out in sobs. "I'm sorry, stepmother. I just wanted to make a pretty picture." Beatriz wasn't willing to listen. Anger had taken over her, and the decision to punish Laura seemed like the only way to handle the situation. Although there was a small spark of regret in her eyes, Beatriz convinced herself that the girl needed to understand the seriousness of her mistake. She decided that the best way to teach her was to let her reflect on her actions in a place where coldness and solitude would be her main companions. With a firmness that didn't match her internal feelings, Beatriz took Laura by the hand and led her to the front door. Laura was confused and fearful, trying to understand what was happening. The cold from outside seemed to penetrate her bones, and she began to shiver as Beatriz opened the door and pushed her out. "You're going to stay out here until you learn not to disobey," Beatriz ordered, her voice still filled with anger. "Think about what you've done and come back when you're ready to apologize." Laura turned to look at Beatriz with a desperate expression. "But, stepmother, I'm going to be so cold out there." Beatriz, although slightly shaken by the girl's words, remained firm in her decision. "It's a lesson you need to learn. I don't want to hear any more apologies. Go outside now." The door slammed shut behind Laura, and the sound of the biting wind filled the space she was in. Laura, now alone, felt the cold penetrating her body, and fear began to dominate her thoughts. Her bare feet and the thin pajama were insufficient protection against the low temperatures. She huddled on the ground, trying to shield herself from the cold, but each gust of wind seemed to cut even deeper. As Laura trembled outside, Beatriz went back inside the house. The warmth of the fireplace and the soft light of the kitchen enveloped her in a stark contrast to the desperation Laura was facing. Beatriz tried to distract herself with dinner preparations, but her mind was divided. Despite the growing regret, she convinced herself she was doing the right thing, and the idea of reversing her decision didn't seem like an option. Time passed slowly, and for Laura, each minute felt like an eternity. The sense of helplessness intensified with every moment. She imagined the warmth of the house and the feeling of safety she had left behind, trying to cling to the hope that someone would find her and bring her back inside. Her thoughts were confused, and the cold seemed to become a part of her being. The clock in the living room ticked on, and the hours dragged. Beatriz was in the kitchen, with a distracted expression, trying to ignore what she had done. She was involved in preparing an elaborate dinner, a stark contrast to the desperate situation her stepdaughter was enduring. Laura remained outside, and the dark night was just beginning. The cold intensified, and the sense of loneliness seemed to envelop every inch of her body. The wait for her father, Marcelo, was the only thing that kept Laura with a glimmer of hope. The night advanced, and the cold was becoming almost unbearable. Laura was huddled against the side of the house, trying to protect herself from the relentless wind, but the cold was starting to overwhelm her senses. The feeling of warmth was almost a distant dream, and weakness was taking over her body. Hypothermia was beginning to affect Laura. Her eyes were heavy, and she fought against the drowsiness that was enveloping her. The cold was so intense that her body shivered uncontrollably, and the struggle to stay awake was becoming increasingly difficult. Her thoughts were confused, and she had trouble distinguishing between dream and reality. Pain and despair seemed to be a natural extension of the darkness surrounding her. Beatriz was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with a growing sense of unease. The anger she had felt earlier was starting to give way to a feeling of regret, but pride and shame prevented her from admitting her mistake. The warmth of the kitchen was a painful contrast to what Laura was experiencing, and the atmosphere of the house seemed more oppressive by the minute. When Marcelo finally came home, the exhaustion of a long day's work was visible on his face. He was eager to be home and find comfort after an exhausting journey. Upon entering, he immediately noticed Laura's absence. The house was too quiet, and he realized that something was wrong. "Beatriz," Marcelo called, his voice filled with concern. "Where is Laura?" Beatriz, with an anxious expression, turned to face him. She is outside. I put her out as a lesson. She made a huge mess in the living room." Marcelo was horrified. "You did what? How could you leave her outside on a night like this?" Despair began to take over Marcelo. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Without waiting for more explanations, he rushed to the door, ignoring what Beatriz was trying to say. He knew he needed to act quickly to find Laura and bring her back inside. As he went outside, the icy wind hit him sharply, but the fear and concern for his daughter were greater than any discomfort he might feel. Marcelo started searching for Laura around the house, calling her name desperately. The darkness and cold made the search increasingly difficult, and his heart raced, filled with terror at what he might find. Laura, with a foggy mind and increasingly weak body, was trying to take refuge behind the house. She had found a partially sheltered corner from the wind, but the protection was minimal. The ground was covered in ice, and the sensation of cold was unbearable. Laura was struggling to stay awake, but drowsiness was overtaking her, and her eyes were closing. When Marcelo finally found her, the scene before him was devastating. Laura was nearly unconscious. Her skin had taken on a pale hue, and her lips were blue. Despair and panic took over Marcelo as he saw his daughter's state. He knelt beside her, feeling a deep pain at realizing how badly she was. Laura, please wake up." Marcelo shook her gently, his voice filled with agony. He was in shock at the severity of the situation and knew he needed to act immediately. Beatriz, who had followed Marcelo outside, was in a state of panic and regret. She knelt beside Marcelo, tears streaming down her face. "Marcelo, I'm so sorry. I didn't know this would happen." Marcelo ignored her words, focusing only on caring for Laura. He immediately picked up the phone and called emergency services, requesting an ambulance urgently. Every second felt like an eternity as he waited for the paramedics' arrival. The sense of helplessness and fear of what could happen weighed heavily on him. The paramedics arrived quickly, assessing Laura's condition and preparing her for transport. They worked efficiently to stabilize her, covering her with thermal blankets and administering oxygen to help reverse the effects of hypothermia. Marcelo, with a heavy heart, accompanied the emergency team to the ambulance, holding Laura's hand and trying to comfort her with gentle words, despite his own anguish. Laura was taken to the hospital urgently, and Marcelo accompanied her, anxious and fearful for his daughter's condition. At the hospital, Laura received immediate care and was placed in intensive treatment to deal with severe hypothermia. The doctors and nurses worked diligently to stabilize and warm her, monitoring her closely. Marcelo, in a state of stress and worry, spent the next hours in the hospital waiting room. He couldn't stop thinking about how the situation had escalated so tragically and how the responsibility weighed on his shoulders. Beatriz had retreated to a corner, her expression a mix of guilt and regret. After 2 days of intensive treatment, Laura finally began to show signs of recovery. She was out of immediate danger but still needed time to fully recover from the effects of hypothermia. Marcelo was relieved to see his daughter recovering, but the guilt and regret for not having acted more quickly still weighed on him. The experience had left a deep mark on Marcelo and Beatriz. The incident had revealed the fragilities in their relationship and the urgent need to face and resolve the issues that had arisen. Laura's recovery was just the beginning of a long path of healing and rebuilding, both for her and for the family as a whole. The cold of the following morning seemed to penetrate the very core of the silent house. The sun was beginning to rise, but the light coming through the window couldn't dispel the darkness that had taken over the home. Beatriz was at home, alone and consumed by a deep sense of guilt. The pain and regret for what she had done to Laura were overwhelming, and she found herself in a state of absolute despair. The weight of responsibility for the tragedy had become unbearable. The memory of the girl, almost lifeless outside, was a constant ghost in her mind. Every time Beatriz closed her eyes, she saw Laura's pale face and bluish lips, and the sound of her desperate words echoed in her ears. Beatriz was in the kitchen, a place now filled with shadows and painful memories. She felt isolated and unable to escape the internal torment she was facing. The idea that her thoughtless action could have caused the death of a child was an unbearable burden. In a moment of despair, Beatriz decided to end her suffering once and for all. She had bought rat poison a few days ago, a substance she had used to deal with unwanted pests in the house. The box of poison was now beside her, and Beatriz picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes full of tears. With a sense of resignation, Beatriz poured a large amount of poison into a glass and mixed it with water. She knew the poison was lethal and that a sufficient dose could be fatal. The decision was made. She could no longer handle the guilt and shame she felt, and the thought of facing the consequences of her actions seemed too overwhelming. Beatriz took a sip of the liquid, the bitter sensation spreading through her mouth and throat. She swallowed with difficulty, her breathing becoming increasingly rapid as the poison began to take effect. Her thoughts were a confused mix of regret and despair, and she felt her consciousness slowly fading. In the silence of the house, time seemed to drag on. The poison was doing its work, and Beatriz began to feel intense pain. Her movements became slow and uncoordinated, and the sensation of cold grew more intense. Consciousness was slipping away, and she knew her end was near. Meanwhile, Marcelo was at the hospital with Laura, waiting for her to recover and be discharged to return home. He had spent the 2 days by his daughter's side, relieved to see her condition improve, but exhaustion and worry still weighed on him. Laura's discharge was scheduled for that day, and Marcelo was eager to bring his daughter back home, where she could recover in a familiar environment. Upon returning home, Marcelo was determined to ensure everything was ready for Laura's arrival. He needed to gather clothes and other items Laura needed, and the idea of bringing some normalcy and comfort back into his daughter's life motivated him to act quickly. When Marcelo entered the house, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The silence was oppressive, and the atmosphere was heavy with a sense of desolation. He called out for Beatriz, but received no response. The sound of silence seemed to amplify his concern. Marcelo began searching for Beatriz, and his sense of unease grew as he made his way to the kitchen. When he opened the door, what he found was a horrifying scene that left him paralyzed. Beatriz was lying on the floor, her body contorted and a look of pain on her face. The presence of the rat poison and water around her were clear signs of what had happened. The shock and pain Marcelo felt upon seeing Beatriz in that state were indescribable. He quickly picked up the phone and called the authorities, informing them of the situation. Police and paramedic sirens arrived quickly, and the house was filled with a whirlwind of activity as the scene was investigated. The officers and paramedics worked to handle the situation, confirming the cause of death and collecting necessary evidence. Marcelo was in a state of shock, his emotions running high as he dealt with the terrible situation. Guilt and sadness mixed in his mind, and he struggled to process what had happened. Laura, still at the hospital, had no idea what was happening at home. Her recovery was progressing, and she was eager to return to the comfort of home. Marcelo, though devastated by the tragedy, knew he had to be strong for his daughter. The situation at home was a heavy burden he would have to face after ensuring Laura was safe and well. Beatriz's death left a deep mark on Marcelo and Laura's lives. The guilt and regret were now part of their reality, and the pain of loss and tragedy was just beginning to manifest. The road ahead would be long and difficult, and the family would have to find a way to cope with the mourning and pain imposed upon them. The soft morning light filtered through the hospital window, illuminating the room where Laura lay. Her recovery had been a difficult process, but the doctors were optimistic that she was out of danger. The nights at the hospital were filled with the constant sound of monitors and the diligent care of the nurses. Laura was eager to return home, and the news that she would finally be discharged brought indescribable relief to Marcelo. Marcelo was by Laura's side, holding her hand with affection. He looked at her with a mix of love and concern. The experiences of the past few days had been an emotional whirlwind, but seeing his daughter recovering was a sign of hope amidst the darkness. "Laura," Marcelo said, his voice trembling slightly, "we're finally going home. Are you ready to go back?" Laura weakly smiled, but her eyes shone with a sense of relief. "Yes, Daddy. I just want to go home." Laura's discharge was a moment eagerly anticipated. As Marcelo and Laura left the hospital, a feeling of relief and hope enveloped them. Laura's recovery had been slower than expected, but her condition was stable, and she was feeling better. The house, now empty and silent without Beatriz's presence, felt different. Marcelo had spent the time after the tragedy organizing things and ensuring the environment was safe and welcoming for Laura. Beatriz's absence left a void, but the predominant feeling was one of relief. The house was ready to welcome Laura back, and Marcelo was determined to create a loving and secure environment for his daughter. As they entered the house, Laura was greeted by a calm and comforting atmosphere. The natural light filtering through the window seemed to offer a warmth she had missed for so long. Marcelo guided her to the couch, where she settled in, feeling embraced by the comfort of her home. "Daddy, the house feels different," Laura commented, looking around with curiosity. "It's calmer now." Marcelo smiled, a smile that carried a mix of sadness and hope. "Yes, sweetie. It's a new beginning for us. We'll make this place full of joy and love, just for us." Laura felt comforted by her father's words. She knew she had gone through a very difficult time, and that the loss of Beatriz had been a painful consequence of everything that had happened. However, Marcelo's presence and the love he continued to show were the anchor helping her recover. The following weeks were dedicated to recovery and adjusting to the new routine. Marcelo and Laura spent time together, enjoying the small things that were once overlooked. Afternoons were filled with board games, reading books, and peaceful walks around the neighborhood. Marcelo's presence was a constant comfort for Laura, and the bond between father and daughter grew stronger every day. Marcelo, still dealing with the pain of losing Beatriz, found solace in his daughter's company. He dedicated himself to being the best father he could be, ensuring Laura had every opportunity to heal and find happiness again. He also sought emotional support, joining support groups and therapeutic conversations to help him cope with the grief and stress he had accumulated. Laura, in turn, began to feel more secure and confident. Marcelo's constant presence and the loving environment he had created were a source of stability and comfort. She started to recover emotionally and find joy in the little things in life. The traumatic experience had left its marks, but it also served as a reminder of the strength and resilience she possessed. The house began to transform back into a home. Marcelo made sure to keep the environment light and positive, creating new traditions and memories with Laura. They cooked meals together, decorated the house with items Laura liked, and spent time exploring activities that brought joy to both of them. Beatriz's presence felt like a distant memory, and Marcelo and Laura were determined to move forward and build a new life together. The relationship between father and daughter deepened in love and care. Laura began to express her feelings and share her hopes and dreams with Marcelo. He encouraged her to pursue her interests and explore new activities, and their trust in each other grew stronger every day. Marcelo also focused on improving Laura's quality of life, enrolling her in extracurricular activities she enjoyed. Participating in activities like art classes and reading groups helped Laura express herself and connect with other children. Marcelo's constant presence and support were crucial in helping Laura recover and find a new sense of normalcy. Time passed, and Marcelo and Laura's lives continued to adapt and flourish. They learned to cherish the present moment and find joy in the small things. The pain and trauma of the tragedy became a testament to the strength and resilience they had found within themselves. Laura and Marcelo discovered a new way of living, marked by gratitude and hope. The loss and pain had left scars, but also brought a profound understanding of what truly mattered. The love and mutual support were the foundation that helped them overcome difficulties and find a path to happiness. As life went on, Marcelo and Laura continued to build their new life together, with the certainty that, despite the adversities, love and dedication were the forces that kept them united. They learned to embrace life with a new perspective, valuing every moment and finding joy in each other's company. The future was uncertain, but Marcelo and Laura were determined to face whatever came with courage and hope. The experience they had lived through had changed them forever, but also strengthened and united them in ways they could never have imagined. The journey of healing and rebuilding was far from easy, but they were ready to face it together with love and determination.